Be there tomorrow, and he would like to meet you. I thought Elvis Presley wants to meet me. It was unbelievable.
Cool.
And I went there, and
For nearly 50 years, Tom Jones carried a secret so heavy, it changed the way he understood everything. A final conversation with Elvis Presley the night before the king died. What did Elvis warn him about? And why did it take 50 years to tell the world? Join us as we uncover the secret Tom Jones could no longer keep. The secret Tom Jones kept for 48 years. In 1977, just hours before his death, Elvis Presley had a private conversation with his closest friend Tom Jones. And for nearly 50 years, Tom refused to talk about what was said that night. But at 85 years old, he finally hinted at something strange. Because according to Tom, Elvis wasn't talking about music. He was warning him about something else entirely. Some secrets are too heavy to carry forever. And Tom Jones carried one of the heaviest secrets in music history for nearly 5 decades, smiling on stage, performing sold-out shows, giving interviews with charm and confidence, but deep inside, holding something back. Most people remember Elvis as the king of rock and roll, the man with the voice, the man with the moves, the legend who filled arenas and made millions of fans lose their minds completely. But the Elvis who reached out to Tom Jones that night was someone very different. He wasn't joking around, he wasn't talking about his next show or his latest song. He was speaking carefully, almost like a man who felt he was being watched by someone he couldn't name out loud. Elvis had always been bigger than life, but that night he sounded like a man who had seen something most people never get close to, a darker side of fame that nobody warns you about, a world where power and influence come with a price. He spoke about dangerous attention, about getting too close to the wrong people, and about consequences that follow when you become too famous for your own good. Tom listened to every word, and then the next morning, Elvis was gone, which made everything Elvis said that night feel like so much more than just a conversation. It felt like a warning, and the question that haunted Tom Jones for nearly 50 years was simple, but chilling. What exactly did Elvis know? And who exactly was he afraid of? When two legends ruled Las Vegas. There was a time when Las Vegas belonged to two men, and the whole world knew it. In the late 1960s, the city was alive with energy. Neon lights blazing every single night, crowds flooding the famous strip. And somewhere in the middle of all that electricity, two of the biggest performers on the planet were sharing the same city, the same stages, and the same extraordinary air that only Las Vegas could produce at the height of its golden era. Their names were Elvis Presley and Tom Jones. Elvis was performing his legendary residency at the International Hotel, a run of shows so popular that tickets disappeared before most people even heard the announcement. And night after night, thousands of fans packed into that grand showroom just to watch the king do what only he could do, command an entire room without even appearing to try. Tom Jones was right there alongside him, performing his own sold-out shows, filling rooms with that enormous voice that seemed almost too powerful for any building to contain. And the city loved them both in a way that felt impossible to fully describe. Because these weren't simply musicians. They were events. They were experiences. They were the kind of performers that people traveled across the world just to witness once from a seat that never felt close enough. But what the audience never saw was what happened after the lights went down. After the shows, when the crowd slowly emptied and the noise of Las Vegas faded into the quiet of early morning, Elvis would appear backstage, not to celebrate loudly or perform for the remaining crowd, but simply to talk, and those conversations were far more personal than anyone standing outside that circle ever realized. Elvis admired Tom's voice deeply, genuinely moved by it in a way that very few things moved him by that point in his life. And Tom admired Elvis in return, not just the talent, but the presence. The effortless way Elvis occupied space, like someone who had been built specifically for this life and nothing else. They became close in the way only two people at the very top of the same extraordinary world can become close, trusting each other in a city where trust was one of the rarest and most expensive things you could find. But even in those early warm nights backstage, Tom occasionally noticed something beneath the surface of his friend's easy confidence. something quiet and unreadable passing briefly across Elvis's eyes, almost like a man carrying a thought he wasn't quite ready to say out loud yet. And Tom never pushed, he simply noticed, and without knowing why, he remembered. The Elvis the public never saw. By the time the 1970s arrived, Elvis Presley had everything the world told you to want. Money beyond imagination. A mansion that felt more like a kingdom. Fame so enormous that his name alone could stop a room. And an influence over popular culture that no single person had managed to achieve before him, and very few have managed since. Because Elvis wasn't just a musician by that point. He was a symbol, a force, a living legend operating on a level that most human beings could barely picture from a distance. But Tom Jones was watching closely, and what Tom saw behind the glittering surface of all that success was something the public never got to see. Elvis was nervous. Not the nervous that comes from performing in front of thousands of screaming fans, because that kind of pressure Elvis had mastered long before the 70s arrived. This was something different, quieter, and harder to explain. The kind that lives just beneath the skin and never fully goes away, no matter how loud the applause gets. Tom noticed it in the way Elvis sometimes paused mid-conversation, choosing his words more carefully than the moment seemed to require, glancing around a room already full of people he trusted, lowering his voice even when there was no obvious reason to do so. At first, Tom assumed it was exhaustion, because Elvis was working at a punishing pace, touring relentlessly, recording constantly, living a life with very little space for rest. And that kind of pressure can make anyone seem tightly wound. But the more time Tom spent around him, the more he realized the nervousness wasn't about the schedule. It was about attention. Not fan attention. Elvis had made peace with that long ago. This was something he described only in fragments. Hints dropped carefully into conversations, like a man testing how deep the water was before deciding whether to jump. Elvis sometimes suggested that being truly enormous in the way he was meant, that certain powerful people started paying very close attention. Not because they admired him, not because they were fans, but because someone with that much influence over millions of people was something worth watching, worth understanding, and possibly worth using. Tom didn't fully understand what Elvis meant at the time. He nodded, he listened, he filed it away quietly, never imagining that one day those fragments would arrange themselves into something that made terrible and perfect sense. Elvis's strange fascination with law enforcement. Most people have hobbies that make sense when you know them well enough, but Elvis Presley had one that even his closest friends found difficult to fully explain, because it wasn't cars, although he loved those too, and it wasn't horses, although he kept those at Graceland. It was something far more unusual for a man of his particular fame and lifestyle. Elvis collected police badges. Not casually, not the way someone picks up a souvenir from a city they visited, but obsessively. Seriously, with the kind of focused energy he brought to very few things outside of performing itself. And over the years, his collection grew into something remarkable. Badges from police departments across the country, sheriff's offices, federal agencies, a physical library of law enforcement identity that sat somewhere between admiration and something harder to name. Tom Jones found it curious. A man who represented freedom and rebellion, spending his private hours collecting the symbols of authority and order. But that contradiction was very much a part of who Elvis was. A man full of pieces that didn't always fit neatly together from the outside. The badge collection alone might have meant nothing, but then came the meeting. In 1970, Elvis Presley walked into the White House and sat down with President Richard Nixon, and that meeting, which seemed almost impossible to believe when it first became public knowledge, turned out to be completely real, confirmed by photographs showing the two men shaking hands in the Oval Office with expressions that belonged to entirely different worlds, pressing up against each other unexpectedly. Elvis had requested the meeting himself, arriving with a gift for the president and a very specific request. He wanted to be made a federal agent at large, a badge-carrying representative of the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. And Nixon remarkably agreed. The badge was issued. Elvis left the White House with exactly what he came for. And almost immediately the questions began spreading quietly, because people started wondering whether that meeting was simply the act of an eccentric superstar with an unusual hobby, or whether it pointed towards something deeper. a relationship between Elvis Presley and the government of the United States that went further than a single afternoon in the Oval Office. Nobody confirmed it convincingly enough to make the questions stop, and what Elvis said privately about it, according to Tom Jones, raised something far more unsettling than any rumor ever could. The rumor Elvis could never confirm. By the mid-1970s, one particular story had attached itself to Elvis Presley so firmly that even the people closest to him didn't know what to believe anymore. The rumor was simple but extraordinary. People were saying that Elvis had been quietly sharing information with federal agencies, that the most famous entertainer on the planet had become a silent observer inside the music industry, reporting back to powerful people about what he saw and heard in a world that very few outsiders could ever access the way he could. Nothing was ever officially confirmed, no documents surfaced publicly, no government official stepped forward with a clear answer, and Elvis himself never gave a straight response when the subject drifted anywhere close to that territory, which some people took as proof of innocence and others took as proof of something else entirely, but the rumor refused to die. It moved through the music industry in whispers, passed carefully from one insider to another, always feeling too specific to be completely invented, and the people who dismissed it entirely were often the same people who had never spent real time around Elvis, never sat in those private rooms after the shows, never watched the way he shifted when certain topics came too close to the surface. Tom Jones had spent that time around him, and Tom noticed things. Elvis would sometimes joke about knowing people in powerful places, dropping the comment lightly into conversation the way you do when something is true, but you would rather it sounded casual, laughing just enough to make it seem unimportant, than moving on before anyone could follow up with a real question. But jokes repeated often enough stopped feeling like jokes, and Tom found himself filing those moments away quietly. Not because he was suspicious of his friend, but because something about the way Elvis handled that particular subject never felt entirely relaxed. There was always a small hesitation, a slight shift in the energy of the room, always the sense that Elvis was carefully editing something before it left his mouth. And that kind of editing doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from practice, from habit, from years of knowing exactly where the line is and staying just behind it. And then came the conversation that made all of those small, careful moments suddenly feel like pieces of something much larger. Because what Elvis said next wasn't casual, it wasn't a joke, and it wasn't something Tom Jones would ever be able to forget. The night Elvis spoke differently. Most phone calls between old friends follow a familiar rhythm, easy and warm, moving from one topic to the next, without any real destination. And that was usually how it went between Elvis and Tom. Two men who understood each other in the effortless way that only comes from years of real friendship built inside the strange and pressurized world of enormous fame. But the call that came in the summer of 1977 felt different from the very first moment Tom picked up the phone. He could hear it immediately, not in what Elvis said, but in how he said it. Something quieter and more careful, sitting underneath every word. The voice of a man who was choosing each sentence with slightly more attention than an ordinary conversation between friends would ever require. Elvis didn't open with a joke. He didn't launch into a story the way he usually did. He started slowly, almost cautiously, feeling out the edges of something before deciding how far into it he was willing to go. And Tom, sensing immediately that this was not an ordinary call, stayed quiet and simply listened. They talked about general things at first, the kind of easy surface conversation that sometimes serves as a runway before someone finally says what they actually called to say. And Tom let it happen naturally, not pushing, not probing, simply staying present the way a real friend does when they sense something important, waiting just beneath the surface. And then Elvis shifted. The easy rhythm changed. The pauses grew slightly longer. The sentences became more deliberate, and Elvis began talking about fame in a way he had never quite talked about it before. Not with pride or humor or the theatrical confidence that usually colored how he discussed his own extraordinary life, but with something that felt much closer to weight, like a man describing a situation he hadn't fully chosen and wasn't entirely sure how to carry anymore. He talked about what it really meant to be watched at the level he existed on, and somewhere in the middle of that, Tom realized whatever he was carefully building towards saying next, something told Tom it was going to change the way he understood everything that came before it. When you become too famous. There are moments in certain conversations that you know immediately you will never forget. Not because anything dramatic happens around you, but because something in the words themselves lands differently, heavier and stranger than ordinary language, like a key turning in a lock you didn't even know existed inside you. Tom Jones had one of those moments during the late-night call, and the words that created it were not urgent or dramatic. They were delivered quietly, almost gently, the way Elvis delivered most things that truly mattered to him, wrapped in a calm that somehow made them hit harder rather than softer. Elvis explained that when you become truly famous, not just well-known, but culturally enormous in the way that both he and Tom were, something changes in the way certain powerful people begin to see you. And that change doesn't arrive, obviously, because it comes disguised as admiration, as access, as the exciting feeling of being welcomed into rooms that ordinary life would never have opened to you. At first, Elvis said, it feels like a reward, like proof that everything you sacrificed brought you to exactly the right place, surrounded by important people who treat you as an equal and make you feel like your influence actually matters far beyond the stage. But then something shifts. Slowly, almost without noticing, you begin to understand that the attention was never really about you as a person. It was about what you represented, the millions of people who trusted your voice, who followed your lead, and powerful people understood the value of that kind of reach better than almost anyone else in the world. Elvis told Tom that getting close to power felt like safety at first, like standing on solid ground in a world that was always trying to knock you sideways. But the closer you got, the more you realized the ground wasn't as solid as it looked. Because power doesn't protect you, it simply finds new ways to need you. And there is a very big difference between those two things that takes most people far too long to understand. Tom listened without interrupting, sensing that Elvis was saying something he had been carrying for a very long time. And when Elvis finally paused, the silence between them felt heavy with everything still left unsaid. Because Tom could feel clearly that Elvis wasn't speaking in theory. He was describing something he had lived personally, and the question sitting quietly in that silence was one that Tom wasn't entirely sure he was ready to hear answered. The warning hidden. Inside the conversation. There are things people say directly, and there are things people say around the edges, circling carefully, never quite landing in the center. And that night, Elvis was doing the second thing with a patience that told Tom Jones everything he needed to know about how serious the situation really was. Elvis never said outright that he was working with anyone, never named a specific agency or a specific person, never drew a clear line between himself and the powerful world he kept hinting at. And Tom understood instinctively that the vagueness wasn't carelessness, it was a choice. The deliberate choice of a man who had learned that some things are safer when they stay slightly out of focus. But the warning was there, sitting clearly inside the conversation, even without a direct confession, and Elvis delivered it with the quiet urgency of someone who genuinely wanted to be heard without being exposed. He told Tom to be careful when government figures started showing real interest in him, not casual interest, but specific and sustained attention from people who had identified something useful in who you were and what you represented to millions of people. Because that kind of interest, Elvis explained, always came with strings attached even when it arrived looking like a gift. Elvis continued, his voice steady but carrying unmistakable weight, explaining that the danger never arrived as a threat. It arrived as opportunity, as connection, as the warm feeling of being valued by people who seemed to hold the world in their hands. And by the time you understood what was actually being asked of you, the door behind you had already closed quietly. Tom absorbed every single word, and when Elvis paused, Tom asked one careful question, wanting to understand how deep this actually went. But before Elvis could answer fully, something in his voice pulled back slightly, as if he had just remembered why certain things were better left in the fog, and what Elvis said next sounded far less like a warning, and far more like a goodbye. The line that stayed with Tom Jones. Some words outlive the people who say them. They survive funerals and decades and the slow erosion of memory that takes almost everything else eventually, staying sharp and clear long after the voice that delivered them has gone completely silent, because certain sentences carry a weight that ordinary time simply cannot wear down. Elvis said something near the end of that conversation that became exactly that kind of sentence for Tom Jones. a line that attached itself somewhere deep and refused to let go for nearly 50 years, surfacing at unexpected moments, in quiet rooms, in the middle of other conversations, always carrying the same strange combination of sadness and clarity it carried the very first time Tom heard it. Elvis told him that sometimes you believe power makes you safer, that getting close to the right people gives you a kind of protection that ordinary life can never offer. And for a while, it genuinely feels that way, real and solid and worth everything it cost you to get there. But then, Elvis said slowly, you realize the more complicated your life becomes inside those circles, the less control you actually have over any of it. And the safety you thought you had purchased turns out to be something else entirely, something closer to a cage built so beautifully. You mistook it for a palace right up until the door stopped opening from the inside. Tom let the words sit in the air between them, feeling their weight, understanding that Elvis was speaking from lived experience that had cost him something real. And when they eventually said goodnight, Tom assumed there would be other calls, other chances to understand the rest of what Elvis had been trying to say. He was wrong, and the following morning would explain everything in the cruelest way possible. The day Elvis died. August 16th, 1977, arrived like any other summer morning, warm and ordinary, giving no warning about what it was carrying inside it, no sign in the light or the air that something enormous and irreversible was about to happen and change everything permanently. Tom Jones heard the news suddenly and without any preparation, the kind of information that lands before your mind has any chance to build a defense against it. And for a long moment, he simply stood still, unable to move the news from the outside of his understanding to the inside where it would have to become real. Elvis Presley was dead, found at Graceland, his Memphis home, and the official story was a heart attack, the body finally surrendering after years of immense pressure and a pace of living that very few human beings could have sustained for as long as Elvis had managed to sustain it. Fans gathered outside Graceland in their thousands, standing in the Tennessee heat with flowers and tears and the stunned expressions of people who had assumed that Elvis Presley would simply continue forever because the alternative was too large and too strange to have ever seriously prepared for. Tom grieved the way you grieve for someone genuinely close, not with public performance, but with the private, quiet devastation of losing a real friend, someone who knew things about you that most people never would. But underneath the grief, something else was happening. The conversation from the night before was replaying itself with a completely different quality now, every word landing differently against the backdrop of what had just happened. The careful tone, the deliberate warnings, the hints about power and consequences suddenly rearranging themselves into a pattern that felt unbearably significant. Because when a man speaks with that kind of weighted honesty the night before he dies, the question that follows you forever is simple and devastating. Was Elvis saying goodbye, or warning Tom about something that was already impossible to stop? The mystery that followed. Death should bring clarity. That is what most people expect. The idea that once someone is gone, the full shape of their life finally becomes visible in a way it never quite was while they were still living it. But the death of Elvis Presley did the opposite. Instead of settling into clarity, his story fractured into questions, dozens of them spreading outward from Graceland in every direction. And the more people examined what they thought they knew about Elvis, the more uncertain and complicated the picture became, as if the man himself had been far larger and far stranger than even his most devoted followers ever fully understood. Some people believed Elvis had known his body was failing, that the years of medication and relentless performing had brought him to a point of no return he understood better than anyone around him was willing to acknowledge, and that the heaviness in his voice during those final months was simply the weight of a man who could see what was coming. Others believed something darker, that Elvis had accumulated enough dangerous knowledge about enough powerful people to have made himself a problem, that the connections he had built so carefully had eventually become the very thing that put him at risk. Tom Jones sat with both possibilities for decades, turning them over privately, never fully able to settle on one and release the other, because the truth was that Elvis had given him just enough information to make both feel real without giving him nearly enough to know which one was actually true. The federal connections, the badge, the Nixon meeting, the careful warnings, all of it swirled together into a mystery with no clean resolution. and the only person who could have provided one was no longer available to answer any questions at all. But Tom Jones had one final thing to say, something he had protected longer than everything else, and the world was finally about to hear it. Why Tom Jones finally spoke? For nearly 50 years, Tom Jones said nothing. Not because he didn't care, not because the conversation had faded from his memory, but because he understood instinctively that some stories carry enough weight to damage things if they land in the wrong hands at the wrong moment. And Tom had spent decades carefully deciding whether this particular story was ready to be told, or whether it was safer kept inside the silence where Elvis had originally placed it. But at 85 years old, something shifted. Tom began to understand that staying silent wasn't protecting anyone anymore, that the conversation deserved to exist outside of his private memory, not as a conspiracy theory, not as an attempt to rewrite history, but simply as a portrait of a man the world had never fully seen, a more complicated, more aware, and more vulnerable Elvis than the legend allowed for. Because that final conversation showed Tom something that no concert footage or Hollywood film or greatest hits collection ever could. It showed him a man who had traveled further into the world of power and influence than almost any entertainer before him, and who had come back from that territory with a quiet understanding that fame without wisdom is one of the most dangerous places a person can end up. Elvis wasn't warning Tom about governments or agencies or shadowy figures in expensive rooms. He was warning him about the oldest trap in the world, the belief that power makes you untouchable, when in reality, it simply makes you more visible to the people who were never on your side to begin with. Tom Jones carried that lesson for nearly 5 decades, and maybe that was always the point. Maybe Elvis knew the warning would outlive him, and maybe that was the only kind of legacy that truly mattered in the end.